Hello, everybody, and welcome to the opening episode of the Fourth and Goal podcast, WVUA 90.7, the Capstone's podcast for all things college football. I'm Caden Johnson, joined by my co-hosts Braden Freeman and Nicholas Elliot, and we have so much to cover today in our opening episode, from close contests last weekend in Week 6, all the way to previewing a huge weekend of college football ahead of us. So, guys, starting off with the Alabama-Texas A&M game from last weekend, we saw the Tide scrape out a 24-20 win against the Aggies at home without star QB Bryce Young. Braden, what did you think about that one?
I think the main thing that we can look back on from that game is missed execution. We have 2 missed field goals. Will Reichert is really, we have not seen him miss field goals more than once or more than 40 yards away at all year. And even throughout his freshman year, he's been lights out anytime he kicks the ball. Against A&M, didn't have that same lights-out foot. Then you had that problem with Milroe, just like not feeling super comfortable out there, still working out the kinks and fumbles and turnovers. And what else do you think, Nicholas?
Yeah, I think really the same situation of Milroe just fumbling. They gave the Aggies just really good field position to work with. They didn't have to work with much field to get their points. And I think that was just the main difference of the game, because if Alabama didn't have that many turnovers, it would have been a much different score.
Yeah, I said before going into this game, I felt like the main way for Texas A&M to win would be for Alabama to beat themselves, and it kind of felt like they did exactly that. Jalen Milroe didn't look too bad, but he didn't really have the best play calling to his advantage. Jahmyr Gibbs looked great. I thought that was like the one positive takeaway that the Tide could get from that, was that Jahmyr Gibbs, if he continues to get the same amount of looks and carries in the offense, he could be like a legitimate Heisman contender. He had 21 carries for 154 yards and then 3 catches as well. So, yeah, I feel like the Tide shouldn't be punished too much for this close win, just considering they were missing a Heisman Trophy winning quarterback. But do y'all agree with them falling to 3rd in the AP poll?
I think a drop to 3rd is hard to say, because Texas A&M, everyone forgets Texas A&M was pre-ranked of the season at number 6. They were number 6 at the beginning of the year, and everyone was hyping up Texas A&M. They had a couple tough losses against Arkansas, and then that Appalachian State loss obviously did not help their cause for any of that. But seeing Alabama drop to 3 with the backup quarterback in is tough to see, especially after Georgia only dropped 1 after barely squeaking out against Missouri, which is a lot less respectable of an opponent as Texas A&M.
Yeah, I just think it's just performance-wise, Alabama didn't really play their best ball offensively, and still just kept the door open for A&M. I think if they build on this performance and just build and just keep winning, they'll get back up to their number 1 ranking before the playoff poll starts.
Yeah, and you see teams like Ohio State being rewarded heavily for beating underperforming opponents like Michigan State, Wisconsin, and it's, one could argue that Ohio State's best win against a Notre Dame team isn't as good as Alabama's 2 best wins, and same even for Georgia. I think both Georgia and Alabama have played probably a little bit better competition than Ohio State has outside of that Notre Dame game, which it's kind of hard to tell right now how good that Notre Dame team is. But anyways, moving on to our next topic, we have Texas, a really intriguing team right now. We've seen a lot from them without Quinn Ewers, and they don't look great without him. But with him this weekend, they played against a Oklahoma team that's kind of falling apart and absolutely demolished them. And it's raising the question, how good is Texas when they have Quinn Ewers? Guys, do you think that Texas might even be a top 15 to 20-ish team with Quinn Ewers?
I think you could argue top 20. Saying top 15, it's still too early to tell. They did not have Quinn Ewers for the second half against Alabama, which was a major advantage for Alabama, as I personally think that they probably would have lost. He looked dominant, and they brought in the backup, and their offense was came to an end, and it came to an end against Texas Tech. It didn't look very good offensively. Their defense has looked good all year, but it's still too early to tell for me to be like their top 15 team.
Yeah, I think Texas, not even a top 15 team. I think Texas with Quinn Ewers is a top 10 team, because the top 25 this year is a little weaker than years past, and I think if they can just keep handling business, get to that 9-3 or 10-2 season, they'll be up there in the top 10. easily.
Okay, so looking at Texas's future schedule, we have Iowa State at home this weekend. Then we have at Oklahoma State, a bye week at Kansas State, home against TCU, at Kansas, which is no pushover this year, as most people know, and then home against the Baylor Bears. It is not really ridiculous to say that at best case scenario, Texas really could win out and go 10-2, or maybe more realistically, go to 9-3. They do have that tough stretch at the end of October and through November. But guys, going through Oklahoma State, Kansas State, TCU, and Kansas, how many of those games? What do you think Texas's record would be through those 4 games?
I think Texas is going to finish 8-4. As much as I hate to say it, I think that they do lose 2 of those games. They are not as quite developed as they could be. I think next year is their year to be a top 10 team. I think this year is their year that they're coming back. They're getting their recruiting class with the new coach, Sarkisian, and I think that this year's their year to show that they're back, and next year's their year to show that they're really back, and they're really back to compete for the playoffs.
Yeah, I think they'll just lose 1 or 2 more games going out. Oklahoma State will be a tough game, especially if that's in Stillwater this year. That environment is no pushover.
Yeah, I'm gonna have to agree. I think that next year we're looking at like a really serious contending team in Texas. This year, I do like them going probably around 9-3 at best, but I feel like a lot of how you can judge Texas right now is based on how respectable of Oklahoma you are, and Oklahoma is absolutely falling apart. It's kind of embarrassing, sad, whatever you want to call it for their program. But anyways, moving on to our next topic, we have Tennessee, obviously, arguably the biggest game of the year so far in Alabama and Tennessee this weekend. Tennessee is coming off of a dominant win against an LSU team that people thought were almost back in a sense, and Tennessee kind of shut that down with the win in Death Valley. How good do you think Tennessee really is?
I think that Tennessee's offense is very good. I think their defense is their biggest weakness, and they're ranked in the 80s in the country. I think 86 to be exact. And to be a playoff contending team, you've got to have a defense. You've got to be able to compete defensively with these teams. You can put up 40 points, but with Bryce Young, Bama's going to put up 40 points too. So their defense is going to have to be spot on if they need to be that good. I think that Tennessee is a great team. They're a top 10 team. To say they're a top 5, top 4 team, probably not enough evidence for that yet, but there's always a possibility. Anything could happen down in Knoxville this weekend.
Yeah, I think Tennessee's great. Their offense is probably one of the top 5 in the country right now, but their defense, their front 7 is really good, really dominant, but their secondary is not very good this year. And it's just I think their ceiling is probably 10-2 with losses to Alabama and Georgia. And that's a good year under the second year of Josh Heupel. And they can just keep building on that. And Tennessee is going to be a great program, and not a program you'd want to see in the SEC East going forward.
Yeah, I was really high on Tennessee. And I don't want to say that I've declined a little bit on that, but it's just that win against Pittsburgh is really starting to look more and more like a struggle win. Pittsburgh took them to overtime, and now Pittsburgh is out losing to Georgia Tech and struggling against teams like Virginia Tech. I'm not going to hold it against them too much. They did struggle against Florida a little bit. It's just some defensive kinks that they have to work out. It looked like their defense looked pretty good against LSU. But, guys, what can you say about Hendon Hooker's Heisman odds if Tennessee pulls off the upset this weekend at home against Alabama?
I think that his Heisman odds go way up. If you beat Alabama, any team that beats Alabama during the regular season that is ranked in the top 10 and has a quarterback like Hooker, I mean, his odds are going to go way up to top 3. Are close to being the favorite. There's still Oregon. There's still USC. The always front runners for the Pac-12. UCLA has looked good maybe the last 2 years. Maybe they're on their way to being the front runner of the Pac-12, but I just think USC has so much coming for them. But it's going to be a close matchup when UCLA plays USC, and then obviously Utah plays USC this week. That's going to be another real decider. If Utah beats USC, then UCLA they are the front runner. They have the best record at that point. So There's a chance of that for sure, yeah.
Yeah, I think the Pac-12 is still wide open. I mean, depending on the Utah-USC outcome, every team, USC could be 4-1 and Utah could be 3-1 after this week. And you still have Oregon has been quietly 3-0 in the Pac-12, and then they are 5-1 after their loss week 1 to Georgia, and they're just quietly winning with Bo Nix. And the schedule is favorable for Oregon going down the stretch, having UCLA at home. And I just think they have a good chance to maybe pull it out.
Yeah, and taking a deeper look into UCLA's future here, they're coming off a bye this week. They'll go play at Oregon the next week, and then, after that, outside of Oregon and USC at home, it's almost guaranteed wins for UCLA if they're able to maintain this high level of play that they have right now. They have Stanford, Arizona State on the road, Arizona, and California to round out the year. But yes, November 19th, home against USC is definitely a game that everybody's going to have marked on their calendars for the future of the Pac-12. And quarterback Dorian Thompson-Robinson has looked amazing throughout the season. He's got 1,500 yards, 15 touchdowns, 2 interceptions. He's another guy that's really slowly creeping up that Heisman campaign. And if UCLA keeps winning, it's going to be really hard to argue against him being in New York potentially later this year. So,
I do not see UCLA going into Autzen Stadium and beating Oregon, though. I think that's going to be a tough environment, and I don't know if UCLA is ready for that.
Yeah, I don't know. I don't know how faithful I am in Oregon. Oregon's just looked weird. They had one of the worst performances by any highly ranked team of the year against Georgia, and then they looked bad for 3.5 quarters against Washington State and somehow squeaked out that one. Washington State choked that game away pretty bad, so it's going to be interesting to see how that plays out, though.
That'll definitely be a top matchup, a probably primetime game for sure.
All right, next question, our last question of the weekly recap. We have Oklahoma State. A lot of people are high on Oklahoma State. A lot of people are low on Oklahoma State. Some people think they're overrated. Will Oklahoma State compete for a playoff spot this year?
I just don't think the Big 12 is going to bring any playoff teams this year. I think they're all going to beat each other, and it's just going to be a bloodbath fighting for who gets the spot in Dallas for the Big 12 championship. Looking at and just saying Oklahoma State, they've fallen off in the past when they've had these chances, especially last year when they lost their playoff spot, when they lost to Baylor in the Big 12 championship. I just don't trust the Mike Gundy coach team in that spot.
Yeah, never forget 2011 Oklahoma State.
Yeah.
With a really big choke, losing to Iowa State in double overtime. That was crazy.
Yeah, it's early enough to say that any undefeated team is competing for that playoff spot, and I think that obviously TCU, Oklahoma State, someone's going to come out of that game with the win. Someone's going to come out of that game losing. Whoever comes out of that game with the win, I think is going to be competing for a playoff spot. I'd be even farther to say that there's probably going to be one playoff team from every conference this year if there's a loss in the SEC and the Big 12 teams stay undefeated, and obviously Ohio State or Michigan, someone's going to beat each other in that game. So there's Clemson's obviously on the container for that too. So
yeah, I like what Nicholas said. I think that I could really see the Big 12 just kind of beating each other out of a playoff spot. Basically what the Pac-12 has done almost every year since the playoffs started. The Big 12 doesn't have that one true powerhouse blue blood this year like they normally have with Oklahoma. I think they're missing that a lot, and I think it's going to show come playoff time. It's just really hard to look at schedules for teams like Oklahoma State and say, yeah, this week they're going to beat TCU at TCU, then they're going to beat Texas, then the next week they're going to beat K-State at K-State, and then the next week they play Kansas at Kansas. It's hard to just really confidently say that they can just fly through those 4 weeks against 4 top 20 teams like that. And same goes for every other team in the conference. Their upsets are destined to happen, so it's going to be really tough for Oklahoma State to get in with that kind of schedule. All right, moving on to the next segment. We've got our top performers of the week. So how that works is pretty self-explanatory. Each of us have picked a player of the week that we thought stood out to us. And I'll go ahead and start. I got Israel Abanaconda, the running back from Pitt. He had 36 carries this week for a whopping 320 yards and 6 touchdowns. I don't think you can have much more of an impact on a game than that. Pittsburgh was able to pull out a win against a really struggling program in Virginia Tech right now. Virginia Tech's not looking up at all. But let's see if either of y'all can find a performance that can top that one. That's kind of tough.
It's hard to say C.J. Stroud's performance with 6 touchdowns, but C.J. Stroud, he does that all the time. As Michigan State, struggling team, struggling defense. I have to go with Thompson Robinson at UCLA. You play a ranked opponent, and you throw, 4 touchdowns for 300 yards. Yeah, he had the interception, but if you're going to go into a game that's that important for your season and be that lights out, maybe throw 1 pick with 300 yards, 4 touchdowns. He was lights out, and he looked great.
Yeah, my player of the week would be Caden Johnson from TCU, wide receiver. He had 14 catches for 206 yards and a touchdown, and completely doubled his stats they had on the year. And he just had a big game and led TCU over 38-31 win over Kansas in a primetime game for Kansas, probably one of their biggest games ever in their football program's history.
Yeah, just touching into that game a little bit more, unfortunately, the loss of Jalen Daniels really hurt them in that game. Some would say that Kansas would have won that game had they had Jalen Daniels healthy. But really, Jason Bean, the backup QB, senior out of Mansfield, Texas, came in and stepped up. He had 262 yards and 4 touchdowns with 1 interception. The interception was really costly, but, you can't really ask for much more out of your backup QB than that. And how do you guys feel for Kansas's future with Jalen Daniels now being potentially out for the year? I think everybody saw his Twitter. He said that the reports of him being out for the year were news to him, quote unquote. So potentially being out for some time. How do you guys like Kansas's future ahead of them?
Yeah, Kansas does have tough games ahead of them. I think if they can just get to a bowl game, that would just be huge for that program under Lance Leipold, especially from where he's taken them from. And I think under their new quarterback, he played really well, especially having to come in under these circumstances. And if he can just carry the load and just keep that team moving, I think they can just at least finish 7-5, above 500, which would be huge for them.
Yeah, I perfectly agree. I think that he's going to do the job there. He's going to help them squeak out a couple more wins, but to be a really competitive team, I think they need the starter back. Same as most teams. They need their starting quarterback in if they're going to really compete for top 10 bowl game.
Yeah, Kansas has more talent this year than maybe ever, and probably more better coaching this year than they've had in a really long time. And not the toughest schedule in the world ahead of them, but not necessarily an easy schedule either. They got Oklahoma State, they got Texas, both of those games at home, and then they got obviously K-State on the road. It's just another example of these Big 12 teams, though, just playing each other out of playoff spots. It's really unfortunate for them that they have to go through that sort of turmoil with their schedule. Every team plays every team in the conference. So, moving on to our college football playoff ranking, out the best. Mel Tucker's had a lot of coaching success against Harbaugh in the past, so look for that to continue. And another thing from Michigan is just that non-conference schedule. Colorado State, Hawaii, and UConn. That's almost just disgraceful to have a team that's competing for a playoff spot to have that as their non-conference schedule. You want to touch on that a little bit, or?
You just got to play who's on the schedule. Michigan's just handling their business. They're still beating those teams by a lot. They're not really struggling with them. But it's just kind of questionable. They're struggling with some Big Ten teams if they can't handle their business. It's going to show at the end of the year that maybe they should have played a better team to start the season.
That's exactly what I was going to say. I think that you got to follow who's on your schedule. You got to play them like you'd play anyone else.
Yep, and just another thing, too, is they really struggled against Maryland, and really on upset watch against them.
Yeah.
And they've struggled against I wouldn't say struggled against Indiana. They didn't look great, but they didn't necessarily struggle. Iowa, they didn't look too good. They didn't look too good against Iowa. It's a lot of just having to pull away late, it seems, for Michigan in conference play. And, I mean, look out. Penn State is more motivated to play this game than any other game this year. I feel like Penn State is really ready for the test. I feel like they're going into the Big House at 11 a.m. sharp this Saturday, and look for a potential upset in that one. But so everybody's got a relatively basic CFP standings, it looks like. Braden did have the take about USC or Oklahoma State getting in.
I love an underdog story.
Yeah,
I love an underdog story.
No, as college football fans, it's kind of cool to like root for something different. I know, we're obviously not ones to talk with going to Alabama, but seeing that change every once in a while is not bad at all. It's like seeing Michigan and Cincinnati in the playoffs last year.
Yeah.
It's nice to have that sort of variety in the playoffs, and I think a lot of people would be really happy to see Tennessee squeak in this year. It seems like they're a pretty big fan favorite team. Not so much fan favorites in this part of the country. But anyways, moving on. As I said, we're still going off the AP poll right now. No college football playoff rankings yet. I think that they come out maybe it's November 1st or 2nd. It's something like that.
After the Ole Miss game, it should be around.
Yeah, somewhere around then. But with the AP poll coming out this week, we're going to do a segment called Overrated, Underrated. All three of us are going to go around and say who we think is the most overrated team ranked too high and the most underrated team ranked too low in this new edition of the AP poll. I'll go ahead and start myself. I have the most overrated team being Ole Miss at 9. I think Ole Miss has struggled bad, and I think that they struggled against Vanderbilt this weekend. We've seen them struggle against other teams too that they shouldn't be struggling against, like Tulsa. Tulsa was I want to say it was a 7-point game even at home against a not great Tulsa team at all. They're really riding that win against Kentucky, and that win is getting discredited a little bit more and more each week. I feel like it's not looking as good of a win as people think that it is. But that being said, Ole Miss is undefeated. It's kind of hard to not have a undefeated power conference team ranked that high at this point in the season, especially when we've had an already like really chaotic year, and it just feels like the top 10 isn't really as strong as it has been some years. But Braden, who would you say is your most overrated team in this new AP poll right now?
It's hard to pick a most overrated team. Right now I feel like most teams are properly rated, but I'm just going to say Georgia should not be number 1. Oh, it should be Ohio State. Like, Georgia almost lost to, Georgia has 2 teams that has seemed to touch the field this year. It's the team against South Carolina and Auburn, which looked really good. The teams against Kent State and Missouri. They've looked a little shaky against teams that they should be handling with no problem. So Georgia at 1, probably not the right spot, but they were national champions last year. I just haven't seen enough from Georgia to think that that's what's going to be. They're going to stay number 1. They're going to do it again. And I say most overrated team is probably TCU. I think TCU, they came off a big win against Oklahoma. They've been getting a lot of hype. Everyone's like, it's Horned Frog season. I got a lot of friends that go to TCU who think that this is their year. I think that TCU probably does not have enough for Oklahoma State, and they might, but like you guys said, Big 12 could beat up on each other. I think Oklahoma State is the front runner in the Big 12, and I think TCU's just come out with a couple games. Obviously, Oklahoma's been falling apart, and that's been and Kansas with the backup in for half the game. I think that just maybe they aren't as good as they are. Who knows?
Yeah, I think I'd have to agree with Caden. I think Ole Miss has to be my most overrated team. Just their offense is not as prolific under Lane. They've been having to scratch and claw more defensively, which is actually good for Lane Kiffin team. You don't expect to have good defense, but their defense is much improved from where it's been. But I just think Jackson Dart has not shown some flashes yet that he showed last year at USC. But if he can show that, I think Ole Miss could still be up in the top 15 range by the end of the season.
Yeah, A lot of people were really high on Jackson Dart, obviously. And rightfully so. He looked good in the Pac-12, but I feel like that just shows a really big testament to how much different of an environment it is to play in the SEC. He hasn't, I don't know if I would use the word struggled, but he hasn't excelled necessarily in that Ole Miss offense yet. But thankfully for them, they have arguably the best rushing attack in the SEC. It's right there with like Arkansas and Alabama even. Zach Evans has been an absolute beast. 79 carries, 469 yards, 6 touchdowns. And then Quinshon Judkins with 580 yards and 8 touchdowns as well. And that's a freshman too. So thankfully for Ole Miss, they have had that ground game to just absolutely carry them at times when Jackson Dart hasn't necessarily been on his A game. And I think we saw that against Kentucky a lot. Judkins had 106 yards and a touchdown in that game. He was an absolute beast. Zach Evans tacked on another rushing touchdown as well. And the Ole Miss defense has been decent at times this year. They were a little shaky against Vanderbilt. They were a little shaky against Tulsa, but for the most part, they've had a pretty good year. You guys look for them to continue their success against Auburn, or is that a game that y'all could see potentially being on upset alert?
I think at home, Ole Miss is going to have no problem beating Auburn. If it was at Jordan-Hare, maybe a different story, but I think Ole Miss is going to cruise through Auburn this week.
Yeah, I agree with what Braden was saying. I think Ole Miss will probably have a first half struggle. It's at 11 a.m., but I think second half they'll just pull on the throttle and just cruise through victory.
Yeah, that's kind of how I feel about it too. Obviously, just with the recent struggles of Ole Miss, I could see Auburn playing this game closer than a lot of people think it is. The line right now is Ole Miss by 15. I actually don't see it being that high, that much of a difference. I like Auburn's defense. Ole Miss's defense isn't bad. It just really depends on Auburn's quarterback play. That's how most of their season has depended anyways. But moving on to our most underrated teams in the AP poll, I'm going to start. I have Texas at 22. We had the segment earlier about where would Texas be, or where should Texas be with Quinn Ewers. I think if they don't lose Quinn Ewers, they don't get that loss to Texas Tech. And, some would argue that they beat Alabama. I don't know about that one, but I for sure don't think they lose to Texas Tech. I think that Texas would be a borderline top 10 team right now if they had Quinn Ewers. Maybe not in that top 10, but I like them over teams like TCU. I like them over teams like Wake Forest. I like them over teams like NC State. And I really think that Texas being at 22 under teams like Utah and Cincinnati is kind of a little bit undercutting them. Same with being under teams like Kansas. Kansas really got their first real test this week and they didn't win. So I feel like you got to punish them a little bit more for that. What do you guys think about the most underrated team right now?
Yeah, I think my most underrated team would probably be Mississippi State. I mean, they're 16th right now, but they've had some good wins. I mean, they throttled Arkansas, throttled Texas A&M, and I think this is probably one of the best Mike Leach teams he's had so far during his tenure at Mississippi State. And even though they had that loss against LSU, I mean, I think they should still be in that 12 or 13 range. They got a big week coming up against Kentucky.
All right, I'm gonna go on the new contenders train. I'm gonna pick Syracuse. I think Syracuse at 5-0. It's a hot take. They've had a lot of close games. They looked really good against Louisville, and they got NC State coming up. Obviously, NC State starting quarterback. It's a questionable situation. He's probably not gonna be playing for a while. I think they have a good chance of beating NC State. They're really the only game that looks difficult on Syracuse's schedule is Clemson and Wake Forest. I could see them pulling off Wake Forest. I don't know about Clemson. Syracuse could finish the season with 1 or 2 losses, and who knows?
They got a really good ground game with Sean Tucker, too. Sean Tucker's probably one of the best, most underrated running backs in the country. He's 500 yards and 5 touchdowns on this year already.
Yeah, Sean Tucker, the big fan favorite. Everybody loves Sean Tucker. He's coming off a huge game where he had 230 yards and 3 touchdowns, and Syracuse basically mercy ruled the FCS Wagner opponent that they played against. going into NC State this week, they're coming off a bye. Some questions about Devin Leary's health. It's gonna be tight in the Carrier Dome. It wouldn't be crazy to say that Syracuse is going to pull that off. I want to honestly say that Syracuse is favored right now, right,
yeah,
guys?
Syracuse is favored.
They are favored.
I think they are too.
It's just a question marks. Who knows if Devin Leary even plays? And last week, NC State was struggling. I mean, I know Florida State's good, but they did not let their quarterback loose at all. They were just not letting him throw at all. And I think that could be struggling with them this weekend in the Carrier Dome.
Yeah.
Yeah. And then just touching on NC State a little bit, there's been a lot of questions, even when Devin Leary is healthy, about their weapons and just their lack thereof, more so, of weapons. And, a lot of people really like Devin Leary as a pro-style quarterback and a future NFL starter even. A lot of people are really high on his draft stock, and it's going down a little bit. And some, like I said, blame it more so on his lack of targets and his lack of weapons on the offensive end. But we'll see how that plays out for them next week, and we'll see if Devin Leary's able to stay healthy. Going back to Nicholas's take of Mississippi State being underrated, I could not agree more. This team is scary. A lot of people
4-point underdogs this week against TCU. TCU's still coming off that big win against Kansas and a hard-fought win. I think Oklahoma State, they cruised through victory over Texas Tech last week. And I just think Oklahoma State, Spencer Sanders has been amazing this year. 1,300 yards and 12 touchdowns, only 2 interceptions. With that experience at the quarterback position, I think Oklahoma State's going to go to Fort Worth and pull that out.
All right, yeah. Feels like I had the hottest take here today with the upset. I just really, I'm high on the Noles. Thought, what, might as well, first episode, might as well come out with a hot take. Moving on to our Pick'em session. We're going to keep up with this every week. We're going to keep up with our records. So we'll start hot. We have a lot of really good games this week. There's a lot of really good games to touch on. Starting off with Penn State at Michigan. I'm going to go ahead and say my pick. I'm rocking with the Nittany Lions this weekend to pull off an upset. Another upset I picked this week. I just feel like Michigan has just struggled so much. You can only have so many close games like that. You can only have so many really big struggle wins, I'll say, before a team really just capitalizes. And I think Penn State is the best team that Michigan has played by a lot this year. And I think Penn State will be the first team to capitalize off of a shaky Michigan team that isn't able to finish teams off.
I'm also going to be taking Penn State that game, but it's hard for me to be like, Penn State's going to go to the big house for 105,000 people and just dominate. Like, it's going to be another one of those squeak-out wins for either team. They're going to come away with the win late in the game. I think I'm going to take Penn State to win. Michigan has not looked dominant against anyone this year in their conference. They've looked good. They have not throttled anyone. They have not, put the hammer down and won by 30 or 40 against anyone in their conference like Ohio State has. So I'll take Penn State for that game.
Yeah, I'm going to have to stick with the home team here, go with the Michigan Wolverines. I just think they're going to have to rely on that running attack with Blake Corum and then J.J. McCarthy. If they can just control the tempo, the time of possession, I think that home crowd will feed off that. And their defense has been great this year.
Yeah, big battle of running backs in this one. Penn State's got the two freshmen, Allen and Singleton, combined for about 800, 900 yards this year. And then Michigan has Blake Corum, who's obviously been probably the team's most electric offensive player by far, and even some would say, like I mentioned earlier, a potential Heisman candidate. I could see it happening. He's probably the best non-quarterback right now, odds-wise, to be in New York at the end of the year to get that Heisman Trophy. And we'll see how that plays out. Next game, we got 15th ranked North Carolina State at Syracuse. Touched on this game a little bit earlier. Syracuse is surprisingly favored to win. North Carolina State having some questions at quarterback. I am going to go with the Cuse holding off the Wolfpack in the Carrier Dome. I think that Syracuse is going to bring out a good atmosphere for this one. I think Sean Tucker's going to run all over NC State, and I think Syracuse will run away with this one and stay undefeated.
That couldn't have said it better myself. I think that that Syracuse at home in the Dome, there's going to be an electric atmosphere.
Probably sold out crowd. I'm looking at Florida State and Jordan Travis to finally capitalize and get a big win here against Clemson. I know that it's a hot take. But Clemson has just struggled a little bit recently in past games, and Florida State has looked good, just other than being able to hold on in some of the games that they've had, especially with NC State and a really bad meltdown last week. They were in field goal range and threw the interception, obviously. But I think that Jordan Travis has a big bounce-back game against this Clemson team, and I think the FSU maybe I'll even say game-winning field goal time expires. What do you guys think about this one?
I like your take because I do think that the atmosphere at Florida State is going to affect Clemson. And Clemson has looked a little shaky at the beginning of games, especially against even Georgia Tech. They didn't look that good in the first half. But they came out in the second half really strong. I think it's going to be like that again. I think they're going to be a little shaky at the beginning of the game. Then something's going to spark a fire in them, and they're gonna come out with probably the win. Who knows? I guess if you think Florida State, maybe there's a chance that it's going to happen. I think that Clemson, they don't have that much ahead of them after this game, and this is their chance to show that they belong in the playoffs.
Yeah, I'm going to have to agree with Caden. I'm going to go with Florida State. Florida State, this is Mike Norvell's year. They had him on the hot seat coming into this year. You don't want to fall to 4-3 with 3 straight losses to ranked teams. I think he's going to have to get the team on his back. He's going to have to coach his way, keep his job. I think this is a game to do so, and they're going to pull it off.
Hey, look at that. Okay, so we have 2 out of 3 of us actually going with FSU, the Noles, to beat the Tigers on Saturday night in primetime. That is definitely going to be one that you're going to want to have on your TV. That is going to be a great game. Next game, we have Mississippi State at Kentucky. This is a Kentucky team that's struggling, to say the least, the last 2 weeks. It's almost like that Ole Miss loss just kind of opened the doors to a team that was getting some struggle wins and is really bringing out that bad side of play. We saw them really kind of get embarrassed against South Carolina last week, and we're seeing a Mississippi State team that's as hot as arguably any team in the country right now. Like I said before, Mississippi State is a fourth-quarter meltdown away from being a 6-0 team. And being a 6-0 team in the SEC West, or even a 5-1 team like they are now, that is no easy feat. I do like Mississippi State in this one, and I'll even go as far to say that despite them playing at Kentucky, I think Mississippi State potentially embarrasses Kentucky. I almost like Mississippi State by 2-3 touchdowns in this one. What do you guys think?
I don't know if they're going to embarrass Kentucky at home, but I think they will. They're going to come out with the victory against Kentucky. Their offense looked very good against Arkansas last week. I think that it's going to look very good again this week. I don't know if Arkansas really is as good as they were when they were ranked number 9, and now obviously they're 3-3, but Kentucky was also, everyone was on the Kentucky hype train. They got that loss to Ole Miss. Quarterback went down, and then it was just they've been on a downward spiral. I don't know if they're going to come back and be good enough to beat Mississippi State this week, but I think Mississippi State's going to go and probably win by maybe 10, 12.
Yeah, I think Mississippi State's going to win this game, but who knows with Will Levis' status? He has turf toe. I don't know if he's going to be able to, if he's playing this week or not. And that's a huge loss for them. They did not look in sync when he was out last week against South Carolina. I think Mississippi State's going to come in and handle business and be 6-1 heading into Bryant-Denny next week.
Yeah, I think this is a good example, too, of just a testament to how important it is to not get upset in the SEC play. You see Kentucky with a really tough schedule. You know, they got to play Georgia. They got to play Tennessee later in the year. Playing Mississippi State, they played Ole Miss 2 weeks ago. It's so important when you're trying to be a competitive team in the SEC to not choke up against the South Carolinas, against the Vanderbilts, against the Missouris. You have to win those games when you're trying to make a name for yourself in the SEC. And Kentucky losing a game like that against South Carolina, it's detrimental to the rest of their season. And moving on to the next game, we got some Pac-12 action here. You know, some would say so far the game of the year in the Pac-12, maybe USC finally gets like a really good test against a Utah team on the road too. This is a Utah team that's coming off a tough loss to a UCLA team that I think most people can agree is legit, right? And I'm looking at Utah to bounce back in this one. Utah is favored to beat USC. This was Braden's upset of the week, was USC actually beating Utah despite Utah being favored. I do like Utah to cover that spread, though, and get the upset in this one against USC.
Yeah, I think Utah is gonna win this game. They're honoring one of their long lost teammates who died last year in a tragic accident. I think they're going to win for him and for the team. I think this is going to be a close game because they've struggled. Their 2 losses, they've struggled with 2 running quarterbacks. I think if they can handle that, and I know their crowd is going to be into that, I think they'll pull it off. It'll be close though.
This is probably going to be the closest game this week. This is going to be a fired up Utah team coming off a loss to UCLA that really can't afford to lose the game against USC. But then you have USC on the other hand, who's looked very good and who's really trying to make a name for themselves to have a playoff spot. So yeah, Utah's going to be fired up. But I don't know if they're going to be fired enough to beat a playoff hunting USC team.
Yeah, that is a really enticing game. Another one that you're going to want to have on TV.
And one of my other takes is USC. They've had an explosive offense, but I haven't seen them been putting up big numbers like 50 points a game, especially with Caleb Williams and Lincoln Riley. They haven't really shown those flashes yet. Maybe this weekend they'll start showing that, but who knows?
Yeah, potentially big breakout game from the Williams Jordan Addison duo. They've had some flashes of really good.
So it's going to be both teams need the win. It's going to be a very hard-fought battle, but I think that there's going to be a late-game interception or fumble that really turns the page on the game and shows who's going to come out with the win.
All right, well, I think that'll wrap it up for us here today. Great first episode. I'm Caden Johnson.
I'm Braden Freeman.
And I'm Nicholas Elliot.
And this is the 4th and Goal podcast, signing out.
WVUA-FM, Tuscaloosa.